Welcome to Monday of the Passion Week. You know, the events that unfold on Monday really began on Sunday. When Jesus made the triumphal entry, he left that wonderful parade into the city in which he was proclaimed king by his followers, and he went directly to the temple. And the scripture is clear that he made an intentional survey of everything that was happening at the temple. It's that forms the foundation for what happens on Monday. Two main events occur on Monday of the Passion Week. You'll read about them and be struck with them, but you need to be aware of their significance. The first is the cursing of the fig tree. As Jesus leaves the town of Bethany, just 2 miles over the hill from Jerusalem and the Temple Mount, he comes upon a fig tree. He's hungry, which I love that, shows his humanity. And as he comes upon this fig tree that has all of its leaves, which indicates that it should have already had small green figs. Wasn't the time for ripe figs yet, but they often ate the small little green undeveloped figs. He comes upon that tree, and because it had leaves, it should have had figs. The little green fig buds came first, before the leaves. But when he arrived at the tree, he discovered that there were leaves, but there was no fruit of any kind. The little green, unripe figs were not there. This became the perfect illustration for what was happening at the temple where he was about to go. There were all the leaves, all the show, all the religion, all the ceremony, but there was no real spiritual worship going on. All leaves and no fruit. And so Jesus curses that fig tree, and that really is a powerful indication of his view of first century Judaism and what it had become. And so then he leaves that fig tree, probably around the city of Bethpage, which means house of figs, and he headed over the Mount of Olives and down to the Temple Mount. And when he gets to the Temple Mount, the second major event of the day, Monday, unfolds, and that is he cleanses the temple for the very second time in his ministry. You remember early on in his ministry, he cleared the temple, and now, having assessed it again at the end of his ministry on Sunday, having surveyed the Temple Mount, having seen all that was happening, he comes again to cleanse it. Why was this necessary? Well, as it turns out, in the court of the Gentiles, in the area of the temple meant for the Gentiles to come and worship, the leaders of the temple, Caiaphas and the high priestly families, had established essentially a money-making scheme. Initially, it was on the Mount of Olives, but under Caiaphas, it had been moved to the Temple Mount itself. And there you had two major businesses going on. The first was a money exchange business, because the money of the first century was pagan, it was Roman, had an image on it. It couldn't be used at the temple, the leaders said. So you needed to exchange your money in order to use it there. So the closest they felt that they could get was the money from Tyre, and so they would exchange the normal pagan Roman money for those coins. And of course, they kept a percentage, somewhere around 4 to 8 cents on the dollar in contemporary terms. And then you took that money, you still didn't have what you needed for sacrifice. You took that money and you bought the necessary sacrifice that you maybe weren't able to bring with you, or perhaps the one you brought had been damaged in some way and been judged by the priest as blemished. And those animals were typically inflated in price, so you're paying more than you would have paid anywhere else. And so it was a money-making scheme of the highest order. And so Jesus comes in and he overturns the tables, he chases them all away, and he won't allow them to use it for those businesses anymore. And that's because he said, my house, my Father's house, and by the way, that's an important way for him to describe it. It explains his relationship to the Father. It also explains the fact that it was intended as the place where God would have his presence manifest among his people. And then he says, you made my Father's house a den of thieves. You're stealing from the people. But it's also interesting that he says this. It was intended to be a house of prayer for all the nations. It's supposed to be not primarily a place of sacrifice. Sacrifice just gets you where you can interact with God, where you can commune with God. But then you were prepared to worship. And it was a place not only for the Jewish people, but for us, many of us who are Gentiles. It was a house of prayer for the nations. And so, as you read Monday's readings, keep this background in mind and see what Jesus is saying. He's saying what has happened with first century Judaism is no longer fruit. It's just leaves, but no reality. And so he curses the fig tree as an example of that. And then he goes down the Mount of Olives to the Temple Mount, and there he cleanses the temple of those who are rendering it completely contrary to God's purposes.